Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me thank each and every one of you for joining us today up on the hilltop. You are here for a very auspicious occasion. This is the inaugural lecture of the Andrew Siegal Memorial Lecture in Israeli and American Middle Eastern Foreign Policy. My name is Jacques Berlinerblau, and I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Civilization here at Georgetown University in the Wall School of Foreign Service. On behalf of our associate director, Anna Sommer, and our assistant director, Dr. Karen Hammerschlag, who's here somewhere. Where are you, Dr. Hammerschlag? She's here. I just saw her. She's laying low. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you here. As per some of our finest traditions, we like to draw attention to members of our executive committee. So just so you know who's in attendance, that is Mr. Robert Burkett, who is senior advisor to President Jack DeGioia. Dr. Gerald Sandler is here somewhere from the medical school, representing the medical school. We also have Uri Z. Soltis. Where is he? Professor Soltis is way in the back, and I want to thank members of our EXCO for being here. Quick note to everybody in the room, there is a sign-up sheet outside. If you like these lectures, please recall that we do 25 of them a year. They are always free and open to the public. So if you give us your name, you will be receiving our bulletins about forthcoming events. One last thing, we're on a bit of a hard stop today. So if you see us kind of moving things along, it's not that we're not gracious. It's not that we don't want to hear more from our distinguished speaker. There's just another major event that's going to be occurring immediately after our own. So we promised them that we would be out of here by 5 o'clock. So there's going to be a bit of a bebop cadence to what we do. I want to begin by thanking Michael Deutsch, who is the person that dreamed up and made possible the Andrew Siegal Foundation and this lecture for being here with us today. Mr. Deutsch graduated from the college in 1988 and later from Georgetown University Law Center in 1992. He went on to work at Eclipse Sports Management for over 23 years and is now a partner with and co-founder of the Singer Deutsch LLP in New York City. He is the person that has made this possible. Mr. Deutsch, I don't wish to embarrass you, but if you could give us a little wave. Thank you very much. The Andrew Siegal Memorial Lecture in Israeli and American Middle Eastern Foreign Policy was created to honor the work and life of philanthropist Andrew Siegal and to ensure the continued support after his death for the institutions and causes that were close to his heart. Andrew was a long-standing advocate for Jewish organizations, focusing heavily on education. Living both in the United States and Israel, Andrew deeply believed in Israel's place in the world and looked forward to a new era in the Middle East in which all nations lived with peace with one another. The Andrew Siegal Foundation, with Mr. Deutsch as its representative and as its principal, believes that the Center for Jewish Civilization, that's us, is an important and critical part of the Georgetown community and is proud to give the CJC its full support. To that end, it has funded the first Andrew H. Siegal Memorial Visiting Professorship with the idea to engage the campus in a continuing dialogue about Israel, the Middle East, and the peace process, and naturally the fundamental issues that are going to confront the leaders of the future. If you look around, folks, you'll see some younger faces, that is 70 and below, right? And the youngsters over here are many of our SFS students, and we sort of count on them to bring the future in terms of thinking about these types of issues. The Andrew H. Siegal Foundation is proud to have our guest speaker tonight, and to tell you about our guest speaker is Professor Robert Lieber, who is chairperson of the Center for Jewish Civilization Executive Committee. Professor Lieber, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jacques, for those welcoming remarks. I will also get right to the point. Before I introduce our featured speaker, however, I'm pleased to note that Ambassador Dennis Ross will be rushing across town from another commitment to be back in time to moderate the Q&A after Elliott's formal remarks. Ambassador Ross is our distinguished visiting professor of diplomacy and is also the William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Both Ambassador Ross and Elliott Abrams are active participants and teaching and participating in Center for Jewish Civilization programs here at Georgetown. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce you all this evening to my colleague and friend, Elliott Abrams. Elliott is a senior fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations here in Washington. He teaches foreign policy for us here with an emphasis on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. He was educated at Harvard College. I should note before that at the Little Red Schoolhouse in Manhattan, which makes him a rather a unique product of that institution. Enough said on that for the moment. He also attended the London School of Economics and Harvard Law School. He served on the staffs of Senator Scoop Jackson and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, was an Assistant Secretary of State in the Reagan administration, and received the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award from Secretary of State George Shultz. He joined the Bush administration, that's George W. Bush administration, in June 2001 as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director on the National Security Council for Democracy, Human Rights, and International Organizations. Subsequently, he held important senior positions as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director of the National Security Council for the Near East and North Africa, Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Global Democracy, and he supervised both Near East and North African affairs, as well as democracy, human rights, and international organization directorates of the NSC. His latest book is Realism and Democracy. I've adopted it for my foreign policy course this spring. And with that, it's, I think, a great pleasure. I won't try to tell you about the book. That's what Elliott is here to do. So with that, it's an enormous pleasure to introduce Elliott Abrams.
Thank you, Professor Lieber, for that very kind introduction, and I should say, especially for adopting the book for your course. I mean, that's really something. And thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Thank you all for being here, and I should begin by apologizing for a cough that you will hear intermittently. The book. I wrote this book about democracy and human rights in the Middle East because I have found in the last few years a pessimism and fatigue about the subject. A lot of Americans in public life and not in public life just basically thinking, well, there was this Arab Spring, right? And we were all quite optimistic, but it's over. It failed, except in Tunisia. And let's get over it. Let's be realistic. It is not going to happen. There are a lot of problems in the Middle East, and it's time for us to be realistic and give up on this notion that the Arab Middle East could become democratic. The theories of why vary. I mean, there's the Islam theory, right? You don't understand Islam. It's a religion that is incompatible with democracy. Or the Arab culture and history theory. You don't understand the Arabs. They're never going to be able to attain democracy. I'll come back to both of those, but I wrote the book in essence to say, hold it. Hold it. That's not a realistic assessment of the Middle East, and I'll explain why. I should say that the first 90 pages of the book are not about the Middle East, they're about America. They are, it's an introduction entitled 40 Years of Human Rights Policy, and it goes back really to the Carter days and tries to trace what happened. What is it about the Kissinger, Nixon, Ford, realpolitik foreign policy in the late Cold War that Jimmy Carter rejected? What was it in his human rights policy that people like Scoop Jackson, Pat Moynihan, Ronald Reagan rejected? How did we develop the human rights policy that we saw under Carter, under Reagan, under Ford, Bush, and so on, from the Nixon years on? But let's talk about the Middle East. The problem, again, is that the Arab Spring, which was supposed to transform the Middle East, didn't. There were these uprisings, but what people say now is, look, when we see the Middle East, what do we as Americans most worry about, most fear? First, jihadis, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, terrorism, violent Islamist extremism. And second, Iran. Iran growing in power throughout the region, Iran with a nuclear weapons program. That's what we need to worry about. That's the argument. And we need to take allies where we can find them. This is a so-called security dilemma. That is, yeah, of course we're in favor of human rights and democracy. We're Americans. We're in favor of human rights and democracy in principle, everywhere, at all times. But we have real threats that we face. We have real threats of terrorism. We have real threats from Iran. And therefore, if fairly brutal dictatorships are on our side when it comes to facing those threats, well, you know, you take your friends where you find them. So let me start with the Arab Spring and say, first, let's ask, what was the Arab Spring? And then why did it fail? And I would argue that the Arab Spring was a series of revolts against illegitimate governments. Illegitimate governments. I think legitimacy, the foreign policy and political science term that is really important for this discussion. There are different kinds of legitimacy. Americans think that the right kind is democratic legitimacy. But in the Middle East, there are a number of monarchies that have substantial amounts of legitimacy. Varying amounts, but substantial amounts. It is, in fact, not coincidental that no monarchy has been overthrown. The outlier here is Bahrain, which probably would have been overthrown if it weren't for the Saudi troops. But that's unique because you have a Sunni royal family and a Shia majority population. For the others, I think it's a clear case of having a substantial amount of legitimacy. There's another kind of legitimacy, what I'd call performance legitimacy. The PR firm Edelman Worldwide does a survey every year asking people, what do you think of your government? And it turns out that over the decades, the UAE, United Arab Emirates government, has rated really high. And so has the government of Singapore. And many times the government of China. Not because these are the greatest democracies in the world, but because they're producing. Because citizens can look at the government and say, well, if you think of where we were 25 years ago and where we are today, the country has changed a lot. We have to give credit for an effective government. But those fake republics, now Tunisia was where the Arab Spring started. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria under Assad, they were not monarchies. They did not perform, and they were not democracies. In fact, on the monarchy side, they were kind of worse. They were fake monarchies in addition to being fake republics. In Libya, the main debate in those years, talking about, say, 2000 to 2010, which son of Muammar Gaddafi would take over after him? In Syria, Hafez al-Assad gave the government, it was supposed to be to his oldest son died, so then it fell on Bashar. In Mubarak's Egypt, the great debate was about Gamal Mubarak following his father. Well, this is illegitimate, these developments. Nobody in these countries really, obviously they didn't choose, but nor did they want to have this kind of phony dynasty. So they were overthrown. They were overthrown because they produced nothing, no wealth, because they had no monarchic legitimacy. They had no democratic legitimacy. The spark hit in Tunisia, and then the others fell. Those of you who are political scientists or students of political science, you know there was a, if you look at the literature about the Middle East in 2000, 2005, 2010, it's all about this term that was invented, Authoritarian Resilience. No government in the Middle East ever changed. So political scientists had to explain that. Then, of course, they all changed. So then political scientists had to figure out a theory of why. Why did this all happen? I remember inviting to speak at Council on Foreign Relations Sir John Soares, who was the head of the British Secret Intelligence Service. And in the Q&A, I said to him, John, aren't you a little bit embarrassed, really, that neither your intelligence service nor any other predicted the Arab Spring? And he replied, Elliott, aren't you a little embarrassed, really, that neither your think tank nor any other predicted the Arab Spring? Well, nobody predicted the Arab Spring. And then it failed, except in Tunisia. Why did it fail? Did it fail because Islam is incompatible with democracy? It's quite simple. That's a very hard argument to make, I think, because there are Muslim democracies around the world. I mean, from Senegal to Indonesia, Malaysia, other countries that go in and out of democracy, Bangladesh, Pakistan. Some are weak democracies, some are strong democracies, some see democracy come and go. But the argument that, well, no, Islam just makes democracy impossible just is disproved if one looks around the world. Maybe Arabs don't want democracy. Maybe that's why these countries aren't democratic. Well, you know, there's a lot of poll data. I mean, there are surveys done over and over and over again. There's a thing called the Arab Barometer. And it provides pretty good proof that Arabs do want democracy, including now, including surveys taken in 2016 and 17. People say they want democracy. Now, what do they mean by democracy? It's a fair question. They say they want democracy. Do they really want democracy? I remember during the Iraq War, President Bush said, don't you think, said to us as Americans, don't you think that if you ask an Iraqi, do you want to be free, that the answer will be yes? I remember a professor, a political scientist at Stanford saying, sure, the answer will be yes, but it's the wrong question. The question should be, do you want your neighbor to be free? Because then the answer might be, my neighbor is a damn Kurd. My neighbor is a lousy Shia. Well, that's going to make democracy a lot harder. In fact, I would argue that's one reason that the Arab Spring failed. Look at Tunisia, the place where it succeeded. The most homogeneous Arab country. Really, totally homogeneous, Sunni, all Sunni tribes, really not very powerful, versus, let's say, Iraq. So first, let's come back to this. Do Arabs want democracy? Yes. I do think that Arab democracy is not going to look like, you know, American democracy or British democracy. But look at Japan. I mean, Japan is a democracy. It doesn't look anything like American democracy. They have an emperor. They have a unicameral legislature. So it doesn't, I mean, it's a very different country from the United States. But when you ask Arabs, what do you want democracy? What does that mean? You get pretty much the answer you'd think. Free elections, independent courts of justice, free speech, free press. Where I think it will look different, Tunisia does, but I think other countries will look even more different. First, religion. We tend to think of the American style of absolute neutrality among religions. All religions are treated alike. Of course, that's not required for democracy. In Europe, there are a number of state religions. I mean, the Queen is still the head of the Church of England. I do not think you're going to see in Arab countries any kind of equality among religions. You're going to see Islam having a special position. Religious tolerance, you may well see, but not the absolutely neutral treatment of all religions. Secondly, gender and sex issues. This is going to take a very long time. In Morocco, for example, some years ago, probably 10 years ago now, the king, who in Morocco has a special religious function, imposed a new family law policy, rights of women, divorce, right to have a divorce, control of children. Poll data showed it was the single least popular thing the king had done throughout the country, including with many women. This is going to take a very, very long time to achieve American or European style gender equality. But I think the basic meaning of what we say in the word democracy will be there. Now, it's going to be hard to achieve in societies that are badly split. Shia, Sunni, Kurd, for example. It is not going, democracy is not going to protect minorities, because majority rule itself does not protect minorities. If we compare the Arab countries to the Europeans who have made it, it's going to be harder in the Arab states. First of all, you know, the democratic situation in Central and Eastern Europe is not perfect either. You see a lot of back and forth in the achievement of democracy in a number of states in Eastern Europe, Central Europe. Secondly, the states of Europe had something the Arabs don't. In Europe, you had a history of democracy in many places. I mean, look at the Czechs, for example. They didn't have to invent democracy. They simply had to return to what they had before World War II. And the countries of Eastern Europe, Central Europe, had a model and a magnet, the EU, and to a certain extent, NATO. They knew what they wanted to do. They wanted to join the EU because they thought it meant wealth, stability. Well, there were political tests for joining the EU. So that was a big pull. That does not exist in the Middle East. I mean, the Arab League is never going to pressure anybody to become more democratic. Let me turn now to this security problem, because what we've said so far is it is possible for Arab states to become democratic, but there are lots of hurdles, lots of obstacles. It's going to be very difficult. Not impossible, very difficult. What is the argument that we should not care? In fact, there's even an argument dictatorships are better for us. It's a security argument. It's the argument that if you open the political space, you know what you're going to get? You're going to get the Muslim Brotherhood, or worse. They are going to win elections. So the only way to stop that is keep the political space closed and rely on the generals or civilian dictators. And I would like to argue that that's doubly wrong. I mean, it is not true that if you open the space, the Islamist extremists are always going to win. And it is not true that the generals and the dictators are actually best suited to defeat the radicals, to defeat the Islamists. You know, this should be a familiar argument. We had this argument during the Cold War, those of you who lived through it or studied it. You remember the famous phrase of Franklin D. Roosevelt when someone mentions that the dictator in Nicaragua, the first Somoza, Anastasio Somoza, was a son of a bitch, and Roosevelt replied, yes, but he's our son of a bitch. And that was the view very broadly in the Cold War. The question was, whose side are you on? Our side or the Russian side? And that was the only question in far too many cases. So now we see the same thing being argued in the Middle East. The only question is, where do you stand on Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the jihadis? And we will rely on such people because if you open things up, the jihadis will win. And look what happened in Egypt, right? They held an election and Morsi won, the Muslim Brotherhood won. Well, I think that's actually a very simplistic way of looking at it. Look, these dictators, and Hosni Mubarak in Egypt is a good example, they don't crush the Islamists. They do a really good job at trying to crush the center, the liberals, the seculars, the Democrats. I remember the 2005 parliamentary election in Egypt. Muslim Brotherhood wins 88 seats. That's not crushing the Brotherhood. Think of Tahrir Square. Where were the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood when that happened? In Cairo, at home, in their businesses. He didn't crush them, partly because he wanted to be able to say to us in Washington, it's me or the Brotherhood. It's me or the Brotherhood. So he saw an alternative, a moderate center, as a great risk. It's not just Egypt, it's standard for such dictators to crush the center. Moreover, the Islamists, who are not in power at all, right? They have no real power in the regime. They get a kind of halo. They're viewed as holy. They're not corrupt, right? Well, of course they're not corrupt. There's no reason to bribe them if they don't really have any power. So nobody does bribe them. So they're not corrupt. So they get a reputation for being wonderful people who provide social services, clinics, nursery schools. When the government falls, they are in a great position to win an election. They have a great reputation. They're not corrupt. They're principled people. And they're organized. They're organized frequently in the mosques. The Muslim Brotherhood was an extremely well-organized group in Egypt, whereas the people in the center, the moderates, the secular people, are not organized because, you know, they're not good at secret conspiracies in dark corners. They're good at politics, or potentially good at politics, but there really is no political combat. So on the day that the regime falls, who's in the best shape to take power? The people who are the best organized. This should not be shocking. We saw this in Cuba in '59 or Iran in '79. And this is what happens. But that doesn't mean they keep power forever. We've seen this pattern all over Asia in Muslim countries, and we saw it in Tunisia, and we saw it in Egypt. What happens when they get power? Well, first of all, some of them become corrupt. Now, for the first time, they've got enough power for people to offer them bribes, and some take those bribes. You saw this with Hamas in Gaza. Secondly, they don't have answers to the country's problems. Their answer is Islam. Islam is the answer. Well, no, it isn't. You're trying to grow the economy and reduce unemployment, create jobs for the youth of the country. Islam is not the answer. And people find that out. They don't perform. Ennahda, the Muslim Brotherhood affiliate party in Indonesia, won the first election. And then they started losing popularity the minute they entered the government. The same thing happened to Morsi in Egypt. They won a victory in the first presidential election, not a landslide. He won 51-49, and then he proceeded to offend just about everybody in Egypt who wasn't in the Muslim Brotherhood and lose popularity. And we've seen this in Indonesia, and we've seen it in Malaysia, and we've seen it all over Asia. The Islamists lose popularity when they get a share of power because they don't have answers. They cannot produce what the people of the country wanted when they voted for that party. So it is not inevitable that if you open up the political system, they will win and they will retain power forever. Of course, it would be nice if we would begin to prepare for the day when there would be a more open political system by strengthening the center now. And I'll come back to that question. But we should not take the view that in any free elections you have in the Middle East, the worst people are going to win. The jihadis are going to win. The Muslim Brotherhood is going to win. And win again, and win again. That's the first point. It's just not true that if you open up democratic politics, it is inevitable that Islamist extremists take and keep power. But secondly, I would also argue that in fact those dictators whom we often rely on are not very good at defeating Islamist extremism. Why not? Well, partly because they spend too much time trying to defeat the center. moderates, liberals, seculars, Democrats. But there's more. Islamist extremism is a set of ideas. It is a theory of the world. It is a theory of how God wants you to behave, how God wants society to be organized. It is a theory of political and national life. To defeat it, it needs to be debated. And the citizens need to be persuaded that theory is wrong. That is not what our religion, Islam, teaches. Policemen can't win that debate. Soldiers can't win that debate. They can beat you up. They can jail you. They can shoot you. But they don't win the debate. And the example I would give you is Turkey over the last, 40 years. Because what happened in Turkey repeatedly was they'd hold a free election, and Islamists would do very well, and the generals would step in. Either they would frequently, several times, they'd disband the Islamist party. They'd call it illegal. They'd overthrow a government. And 5 or 7 or 8 years later, the exact same things would happen. The Islamists would change the name of their party. Instead of justice and welfare, it would be welfare and justice. But they have a new party, and they'd have an election, and they'd win again. And the generals would step in again. Meaning that people were not persuaded. They were never persuaded. The generals took power, but what did not develop was a political system in which more moderate parties were able to win election after election and guarantee democratic stability. So, I would argue, relying on dictators to defeat Islamism will always work in the short term. Jail enough people, kill enough people. But it will not work in the medium to long run because they aren't debating or winning debates. They're just repressing. And what they are repressing will emerge again. What should we be doing? And I will just spend a few minutes on this and stop. What should the U.S. be doing? First, we should be protecting Arab Democrats. There are Arab Democrats. There are not enough of them from the American point of view, but they exist, and we should protect them. We should protect them politically, that is, when they're arrested or jailed, beaten. We should protest privately and publicly, whatever will have the greatest impact. We should protect them by offering them sometimes a safe haven. There are a lot of programs starting now that do that. I think there should be more that will say to someone, for example, coming out of prison, you know what? Take a semester at Georgetown. Take a semester at some American or European university. Rest, relax. Take your family with you. Think, have a chance without worrying about the police coming tomorrow, to think about your experience and where you want to go from here. Sometimes it's just a conference, a week out someplace. Sometimes it's saying to a family, your breadwinner, the husband or wife, is in prison. Can we help you survive? Cash. And there are NGOs that do this. So helping and protecting Democrats is something I think we should do. I think we should focus more on politics whenever we can. There are some countries where there is no politics. But in other countries where there is politics, we still tend to focus on NGOs and civil society. That's often a mistake, I think. The problem with many of the NGOs and civil society organizations is they're too much like us. We like them because everybody speaks English, and they were probably educated here, indeed, even at Georgetown specifically, educated in the US or in Europe. They know about, accounting and what kind of records we need to see. But very often their real base is here in Washington or London or New York, not in the countryside. Often they communicate better with us than with the rest of the population. And very often, though they're aiming for wonderful things, clean water, clean air. They're not engaged in politics. And here's what I mean by that. I tell a story in the book about Nelson Mandela. At a point in which he had become president of South Africa, a group of Nigerian dissidents, NGO people, came to see him because there was a military dictatorship in Nigeria. They wanted to organize an oil boycott to bankrupt the government so that it would fall. And so they went to see Mandela, and Mandela said no, which shocked them. And he said, look, my group, the ANC, the African National Congress, we were not an NGO. We were a political group whose goal was to seize power and govern. And we're doing it. You guys, he said, what would happen if the government fell tomorrow? You're in no position to take power. You're in no position to govern the country. What's the point of bringing down the government? If a better government is not going to replace it, why should we do that? You're not ready. That's why I think we need to try to concentrate more on political groups when we can, rather than just NGOs and civil society organizations. And when we can't, I think we ought to look at the NGOs and try to figure out, as best we can, which are the ones that are likely to be able to make the transition into politics. I think we should be giving our help through nonprofits. We give an awful lot of money through Beltway Bandit organizations that seem to produce a lot of Mercedes-Benzes for the people who work there or who own it, rather than producing democracy. And one of the reasons for that is summed up in the word tameness. Tameness. That is, if this is your business, the worst thing that could happen to you is to get kicked out of the country. It's Egypt, for example, today. You get kicked out, you lose your contract with AID, no money. So you don't want projects that are going to get you in real trouble with the government. You want nice, tame projects. But that's never going to push for democracy and human rights in the Arab world. I'm going to stop so we have plenty of time for questions. I think we need to be realistic enough to say that democracy is going to arrive slowly in the Arab world, late in the Arab world, and it may arrive, disappear, and arrive again in various forms, sometimes weak forms. Sometimes, oddly enough, there will be more progress in the monarchies, progress toward becoming constitutional monarchies than there will in some of the other countries. But defeating the Islamists, in my opinion, is going to require more than policemen and soldiers. It's going to require legitimate governments that can make arguments that defeat their arguments and win the loyalty of the population. So my bottom line is, I don't think that abandoning democracy and human rights is in fact a realistic foreign policy. And if we're talking about realism, realpolitik in foreign policy, it strikes me that being indifferent to the development of democracy and human rights in the Arab Middle East, allying instead with brutal dictators who rule exclusively by force, is not a realistic policy and will not effectively defeat the very real and dangerous enemies that we and the peoples of the Arab Middle East share and fear. Thank you very much. Are we going to sit?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to have another of our faculty members, Ambassador Dennis Ross. So this is the good stuff. This is a special treat. Ambassador Dennis Ross will begin by asking questions of Elliott Abrams, and then we will turn the floor over to you. And it would be great if the ambassador.
I think I have. Yeah,
I've got a microphone too. Yes. Good.
I think between Elliott and me, we only have about 60 years of governmental experience. So take what we say with a grain of salt. I want to start by just picking up on the last point you made. Elliott was referring to realism, realpolitik, and anyone who studies political science knows that there's the realist school of political science, And the one interesting thing about the so-called realist school is that it believes that a nation should pursue only very narrow interests, and values should never play a role in the pursuit of policy. And one can argue that sometimes if you focus only on values, you might lose sight of what could be immediate sets of interests. But if you pursue a policy that is devoid of any values, at least in the case of the United States, you're going to find it very difficult to sustain. How do you explain a policy that is so divorced from our own ethos? And yet, when it comes to the Middle East, I think it's fair to say that's exactly what we've done. And I want to start by posing a question to you related to the policies in the Bush 43 administration. Condi Rice went to Cairo and gave a speech. At one point, she said, for 60 years, we said we pursued stability over freedom, and we got neither. And this was a very powerful statement, and it reflected in many ways what was the freedom agenda of President Bush. And yet in the last couple of years of the administration, it's not an agenda that was pursued. What happened? Why?
It's a good question, a fair question. If you look at the president, if you look at the president's activities, you would not know that there had been a falling off. That is, Bush continued to meet with Democratic activists and dissidents. He went to a conference that Natan Sharansky ran, a dissidents conference in Prague. He, in his last visit to the UN, September 2008, he held a little dissidents conference on Governor's Island. Sharansky was there, and many others from China, from all over the world. So Bush never deviated, but the policy changed. Partly, I think it was that he himself, at that point, was concentrating his efforts on Iraq and the surge and paying less attention to the rest of American foreign policy. And maybe one could say that with any administration in the last year or two, certain fatigue sets in.
Sure.
But I think there was another piece of it, and it is that I think that Secretary of State Rice decided to make a big push for Israeli-Palestinian peace. So we had the Annapolis Conference just around Thanksgiving 2007, but of course that was the end of about 6 months of work. I think that she came to the conclusion after the Israel-Hezbollah war in the summer of 2006 that she needed to step up her efforts to get some kind of peace for Israel. And she concentrated on that. And that meant that the foreign minister of Egypt and the president of Egypt, the Saudis and others, were now, in her view, needed, in her view, because I'm not sure we can debate how much that was true, but she did not want to go to Cairo now and make a speech that challenged Mubarak on human rights. She wanted to go to Cairo and talk to him about Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Annapolis, what could follow on Annapolis? Could a deal be done before January 20th, 2009, when Bush would leave office? And in this period, Ehud Olmert, the Israeli prime minister, is constantly saying, yes, yes, we can do this, yes. So the focus, I think, on human rights in the Arab countries really diminished.
It is interesting. It's a reminder that whoever is making foreign policy always is making foreign policy in a context. Priorities may start off one way, and then reality may impose itself in a way that produces a different set of priorities. It's interesting that when Obama came in, just like Trump is the anti-Obama, well, Obama was the anti-Bush. Yeah. And when Obama went, and I say this from someone who spent the first 3 years of the Obama administration in the Obama administration, but I was working on Iran to begin with. And what's interesting is when Obama went to Cairo, this is a little known fact, but if you go back and you actually get the transcript, you'll see it. He was going through a series of positions to show the contrast with Bush. You know, he was emphasizing, we don't lecture. You know, you'll choose your own path. We still believe in our values. When he got to democracy, he said the word democracy, and he got applause from the audience. And he stumbled because he was raising democracy in a way to say, we're not going to impose anything on you. He was trying to show the contrast with President Bush. And in some ways, his reaction to Mubarak 2 years later was a recognition that maybe he shouldn't have done what he did at the beginning of the administration. So the question I want to ask you is, when you look at what the Obama administration did in 2011 after Tahrir Square, what are the lessons you would draw from that? What are the things that might have been done differently? I mean, in every case, there's an old saying that crises are terrible opportunities to waste. But one of the things that is too rarely done is really doing serious lessons learned when you have events and situations that turn out to fail. You don't tend to learn a whole lot from your successes. You should learn from your failures. Clearly, how the administration responded to the Arab Spring, which I think should have been called more likely an Arab awakening, didn't produce what the administration sought, and obviously didn't materialize with the kind of things we wanted to see. So what, especially as someone who has studied this and who feels deeply about it, are there a specific set of lessons you would draw from that?
In one way, I really dislike this question because it forces me to defend the Obama administration. But it's a fair question. Yes. Well, first on Egypt, the reason I say that is that you and I have both heard from Arabs, particularly in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, quote, "Obama threw Mubarak under the bus," close quote. I really must have heard that 50 times. And it is false, in my opinion. I was one of the people who was saying to the Obama administration, 2009, 2010, this Gamal thing is really dangerous. Neither the army nor the people of Egypt are going to accept him as president. It is not as stable as you think it is. So there was reason to worry about Mubarak. And then, after Tunisia, there's a huge uprising against Mubarak. Now, what does the United States do? What does the President of the United States do at that moment? Not 6 months before. Yes, I think the administration should have been talking to Mubarak more 6 months before, 1 year before, about repression in Egypt, democracy in Egypt, about Gamal. What do you do when the uprising happens? No American president is ever going to pick up the phone and say, you know what your model ought to be, Hosni? Tiananmen. See, if you would just mow down a few thousand people in Tahrir Square, you could put this thing, no president's ever going to say that. What is it that Obama did that threw Mubarak under the bus? He did not advise him to kill lots of Egyptians, nor did he send in the Marines to save him. The army in Egypt decided that Mubarak was too expensive. He now had to go. So at that point, at the very, let's say from Tahrir Square on, I do not think that President Obama threw him under the bus or could have acted differently or could have had much influence. So the lesson I learned there is, I guess, there are times when you have a possibility of influencing the outcome someplace. Maybe if we had talked to him over a period of years, because the Gamal candidacy was in the air for certainly in the last few years of I would say the whole second term of Bush. Maybe we could have influenced Mubarak. But then in the crisis, it's too late, and you have to kind of gauge, where do we stand today? What can we do today? So the lesson there would be that you can't wait until the last minute, because then not only have his options disappeared, your options as president have also disappeared. I do think that the 2009 Iranian Green Revolution shows, though, that there are times when the president, in my opinion, when President Obama wasted an opportunity. There is no way to prove, sitting here in 2017, that if we had vocally supported the Green Revolution, the outcome in Iran would have been different. It's impossible to prove it. But I think that regime was wobbling. There is some evidence that even parts of the Revolutionary Guard Corps were wavering in their support of the regime. And the argument that, well, no, we couldn't do it because it would have hurt the Green Revolution to have Barack Obama say, we think it's wonderful, I don't believe that for a second. First of all, he was popular in many places overseas. Secondly, anyone who studies Iran will tell you that the Iranian people actually have a very positive view of the United States. So there is an opportunity, I think, where the lesson is that sometimes moments arise when you might be able to do some good. Don't waste them.
What's interesting is it requires, and I have a few people here who have taken my statecraft course. One of the points I make is you really need to have good assessments. You really have to understand what the situation is. That tells you whether this is a moment where you have the potential to intervene and have an effect, or whether you have the potential to intervene in a way that may actually be counterproductive. What happened with Obama, to be fair to him in 2009, it was not because there had been an exchange of messages at this point with the Supreme Leader, which there had been. It was because the administration was getting two conflicting set of messages. From the Green Movement that were outside of Iran, the message was, you need to be loud, you need to be vocal, you need to seize the platform, especially given who you are. From the message from within Iran, it was just the opposite. We have credibility, they're going to try to tar us with your brush and say that we're your creation. And to be fair, we had a discussion on this, and the decision was to go ahead and sort of listen to those who were on the scene. And I have to admit, as someone who had been around for a while and actually had been with Baker when he first went to Russia, to the Soviet Union, and then to Eastern Europe, the argument of those in the bureaucracy when I was setting up the meetings for him was, don't take meetings with the dissidents, you'll actually damage them.
Yep.
And I said, well, isn't it interesting that they're the ones who are saying that we should be seeing them? They actually think this builds deterrence for them. And I think the instinct, in this case, we listened to the message we got from within the region, but I think they were not the right message. And again, President Obama later felt regret over it. He felt it was the wrong thing to have done. Now, what is also interesting is that, I agree with you, look, when 2 million people are in the street, we didn't throw anybody under the bus. Right. We don't have that power. The real question is, and you're putting your finger on it, what could we have done at that time? I can tell you the kind of things we did. The whole idea at that point was to try to bring in and establish a set of principles that had been drawn from other cases. And in fact, we put together delegations of those from Eastern Europe to have them go down and talk about kind of things that should be done to begin to develop institutions, which I think was right. Where I think we were wrong is that we were much too gentle with the military. Every time we went to the military and said, look, the last thing you need to do right now is hold an election for the parliament because you are not organized for it. The forces who produce this are not organized for it, and you know who is organized for it. The Muslim Brotherhood is organized for it, the very points you were making earlier. And Tantawi just blew us off. And we simply accepted it, which was, I think, it comes back to recognizing also not just making a good assessment, but where your leverage is. If we have leverage, and we had some on Tantawi, but the minute he saw that we withdrew, then he knew he could continue to hold firm, and his own judgments weren't very good, proven by the fact that when Morsi came in, right, Tantawi was out. Right. So there is a lot that one has to do in terms of trying to make basic judgments.
I have wondered, just taking Egypt, that election that Morsi won, he won 51-49 against arguably the weakest candidate who could have appeared against him, General Shafiq. Shafiq had been an Air Force officer, protege of Air Force General Hosni Mubarak. He'd been the head of the Air Force under Mubarak. He'd been Minister of Aviation under Mubarak. And there was a case where, why did Mubarak, and why particularly did Mrs. Mubarak want Gamal to be president? So she was, I think, the real engineer. Well, I don't think it's very hard to figure out. She was worried about her future and the family's future. At this point, Mubarak is 80. She was about 15, 20 years younger. What happens to them after President Mubarak dies? Do they go to prison?
Right.
What happens to them? I was very struck. I had a conversation a while ago with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the Russian dissident, 10 years in prison under Putin. And he said something that really struck me. He said, you know what Gorbachev did after Gorbachev lost power? He went home. He went home. How is it that he could go home? I asked. He didn't steal money, was the answer that Khodorkovsky gave. Well, in the Middle East, that's pretty rare. And so if you're the Mubarak family, you know, it's not just the presidency that's at stake here, it's everything. It's your entire future of the whole family. It struck me then that, you know, if we had said to Mubarak a year before, you know, it's not going to work with Gamal, which I think he actually at some level wondered about himself. But the family can be protected by General Shafiq. Move toward a more open and democratic system. Have a candidate who can actually run. And Shafiq proved he could by almost winning the election under the worst possible conditions, and start moving the country forward. In 2005, we pressured Mubarak to hold a presidential election. Do you know that prior to that, neither he nor his predecessors had ever been in an election? The parliament chose them. So he held an election. Free election, no. But we thought, okay, first you hold an election. Then maybe the next one is mostly free. And then maybe 5 years after that, it's actually free. And after all, Mubarak was 80. We thought, he's not going to run again. So I think had we all had this wisdom a couple of years in advance or 5 years in advance, maybe we would have had enough influence to change the outcome.
You know, I want to give you a chance to ask questions, and we also have to wrap up by 4:40 because there are books for Elliott to sign, and I actually have to go teach. So there's a dual imperative there.
Yes.
But I want to ask one more question, and actually give you a chance to speak more about it. You addressed it a little bit. I've heard you speak about this, and it's in your book. There are different kinds, different forms of legitimacy. Yeah. The monarchies in the Middle East, there hasn't been one that was swept away. It doesn't mean they're all necessarily invulnerable, they're not, but they have a kind of dynastic legitimacy. Yeah. Legitimacy means you have a right to rule in the eyes of your people, and the monarchies actually have that. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card, but it gives them it gives them something that none of the so-called republics had. Speak a little bit about the sources of legitimacy in the Middle East, because we're not going to see instant democracies. That was your point just now, that if you're thinking about how you do this, it's an evolutionary process. If it's revolutionary, the odds are the wrong forces are going to be the ones who seize power precisely because the institutions aren't there.
Well, if we go back, and I was saying this actually just before you arrived, you can't create a monarchy, right? A monarchy that is created tomorrow morning in one of these countries is not going to have legitimacy. So you're dealing with the ones that exist. In many cases, they've existed for a long time. And in many cases, the king is a descendant of the prophet and has a special legitimacy for that reason, too. You can lose that if there's tremendous amount of corruption and brutality. You can gain more if people see that you are trying to help the country and are a little bit above politics. The kings play a kind of double game because they are the monarch, they are above politics, but meanwhile, just beneath the surface of the water, they're kicking and punching to make sure that they get their way. You know, I think the advice, we have in a way the same advice for new democratic and monarchic regimes, which is you better add performance legitimacy to whatever you get. Because ultimately, you will lose if everyone says this country's going to hell in a handbasket, including if you are a legitimate king. So the need for particularly economic performance is strong in either case. In the democratic case, you'd better not drift toward a reimposition of brutality and repression and monarchy. I mean, the royal family idea, which is a disastrous idea, and affected Libya, Syria, and Tunisia, and Egypt with Gamal Mubarak. So I think we have advice for them as well. But it's it is striking that the monarchies in the Middle East, which can be attacked as incredibly old and medieval and backward, and are not so backward in the eyes of their people. In fact, I know we're running out of time, but I'll tell you a very quick story.
Yep.
I had a friend with a factory in Morocco, and the king's reaction to the Arab Spring was to promulgate a new constitution, which was more democratic, in that the head of the largest party in parliament is automatically prime minister. So my friend was in his factory in Casablanca, and he said to an old guy who'd worked for him for 30 years, "Are you going to vote in the referendum next week on the new constitution?" The old guy said, "Well, the king says to vote, so I'll vote." No enthusiasm. So my friend said, "Well, are you going to vote yes for the new constitution?" And the guy said, "Well, I don't like it, but the king says yes. We should vote yes, so I'll vote yes." So my friend said, "Well, why don't you like it? Why don't you like it? I mean, it's more democratic. It'll be a more democratic political system." And the old guy said, "I'll tell you why. Because I want to be ruled by the king, not some lousy politician." There's a lot of that.
Right. But there is an interesting, you'll go throughout, especially Jordan, and you'll see a distinction drawn that way. Not everywhere, but that is an interesting distinction. Okay, so we've got a little bit less than 10 minutes for questions.
Hello. I have a question. How do you think the transition plan in Saudi Arabia is going long-term under the new king?
I tend to be pretty impressed, and I've read what Dennis has written about this. I think we were in agreement on this. The king understood, and the crown prince understands. They were up against the wall. Very large population, maybe 35 million now, unlike Qatar or the Emirates, which really have no citizens to speak of, and tremendous unemployment, and an educational system that isn't training people for the 21st century, and oil prices down by half. So thus the Saudi 2030 plan, and thus step one on women, which is driving. But that's just step one. So they've got a tremendous hill to climb. And I don't think they or we can have any assurance they're going to do it. But they understand the nature of the challenge, and they're starting, I would say, to act as if they did and as if they have real pragmatic steps in mind to move forward.
Yes, if we accept your premise of democracy is going to take time, it will be up and down to get there, we as a country still have a very legitimate security concern. And if we turn away from our current theory of you're our friend, so while this takes place, how do we deal with our security concern?
Well, first, we're taking a lot of steps to guarantee our own security, and we have to. Airport security, for example, beefing up the organs of the U.S. government that deal with this counterterrorism question. But I would also add that I think, look, let's take Egypt, because Egypt with 90 million is by far the largest Arab population. Today there are 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt. 60,000, meaning people who have never been convicted of anything. They were arrested and put in prison. Or they've been convicted in a phony trial, or they've been convicted of something peaceful that we would not consider a crime. You throw those people in prison, and who else is in the prison? Muslim Brotherhood people, jihadis, ISIS people, Al-Qaeda people. Let that stew for a few years, and you know what you've got there? You've got a jihadi manufacturing plant. So that doesn't secure our own safety. And I think we need to, while on the one hand we need to work with President Sisi on the question of security in Sinai, where ISIS is clearly making a play, we also need to talk to him about the brutality and the repression in Egypt, which I think does not actually make us safer. It will, in the medium run, make us less safe.
Hi. So my question is, how does the U.S. support, say, democratic groups in those countries without being perceived as being provocative and supporting rebellious groups in those countries?
Well, in some cases, we will be perceived as doing that by dictators, even if we're not doing very much at all. But I'd say there are two things we should do. First, the support of democracy works best when it comes from the top, the president, the secretary of state, the vice president, rather than just the U.S. ambassador. U.S. ambassador can always be ignored if the sense is, for example, well, he or she doesn't really speak for Washington. So leadership is important. And I would say, for example, on the question of Venezuela, a country where the President Trump, has been outspoken, and that's been very helpful. Secondly, the programs. You know, we do through AID, the National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republican Institute, National Democratic Institute, we do programs that help train people in how to organize a party or how to be a better journalist. Those programs we should try to continue. And sometimes when it is not possible to do that, we can take them offshore. And so we can't operate in Egypt, but maybe Egyptians can come out and we can do these things in Morocco, let's say. So, you're always going to be accused of fomenting subversion and fomenting revolution. The question is whether you really are, and we really aren't. So we just need to move forward.
Over there.
Thank you very much. So very quickly, first of all, thank you very much for your talk. Just to make it clear, I do believe that the absence of democracy in a country is first of all due to domestic factors. But my question would be about the role of the US. And how do you value the impact of the US foreign policy on the absence, to some extent, at some point, of the democracy? I mean, and it's also a question for you, maybe, Mr. Ross, because you have mentioned, for example, Roosevelt's word on Somoza. As far as I remember, it's Eisenhower, not Roosevelt, but well, I think.
You know, I would say
thank you very much.
The United States has a mixed record. There are cases where we have been forceful and successful in promoting democracy. There are other cases where we have been indifferent to democracy, and it changes over time. I mean, I worked for Ronald Reagan when we had this vast expansion of democracy in Latin America, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Peru, in El Salvador, in Chile. Was that because of the United States? No. As you started, it was because of the people of the country. But did we support them or oppose them? We supported them in their effort to get rid of the dictatorships. So there is a very checkered record here, and it remains, I would say, checkered to this day.
We have time for one more. I'll just make one very brief comment on that. I said it earlier, oftentimes in foreign policy, you'll have a tension between objectives. And the way you really determine your priorities is how you choose between those tensions. Oftentimes, taking the easy way is not to be supportive of human rights or democratic forces. And the problem with that is it usually comes back to haunt you later. And it certainly has contributed to accusations of us being hypocritical. Now, oftentimes, those who make that are not the people who really care about the values. They just use it as a club to beat us over the head with. But I'll tell you one thing about diplomacy. One of the main things you do in diplomacy, you take away excuses. So we shouldn't easily give pretexts or provide excuses. Okay, so we have time for one more. Where is it? All the way in the back. Sorry.
You mentioned earlier that it's going to be a while in the Middle East before women's rights are up to par with the West, but it's in probably the Westerns, just from a human rights perspective, interest to accelerate that process. How can we in the United States best do that?
Well, we need to talk about it a lot. For example, we should be congratulating the Saudis on this first step and urging them to take a second and a third and a fourth. In other countries, we should be urging them and offering any help we can when it comes to, say, changing let's say, a family law code to give more rights to women. Now, we don't know anything about this much, right? But there are Islamic countries that have done this. And we can offer to say, well, we can convene a conference. Or we can pay to have experts from Morocco, Indonesia, wherever, come and offer you their expertise. So we can give some practical help, even though this is not our culture and our religion. I think, particularly if you're going to criticize governments, and we will often be criticizing them, this is an opportunity to cajole, to urge, to reward, to compliment whenever there is progress, and to criticize. I don't think we were critical enough of the Saudis over the years on the treatment of women. We tended to say, oh, well, you know, the Saudis, it's just hopeless. When, in fact, we know that there were many parts of Saudi society, including many parts of the royal family, that thought this was ridiculous and medieval. So I think pushing harder, not condemning, pushing harder, will in some places have quite a positive effect. And the demonstration model, in the sense of American women, can also be very effective.
So please join me in thanking Elliott and also going out and getting his book.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was good. It was really good.